You know, I don't like sand. It's rough and coarse and irritating and it gets everywhere, but the silver lining is that means the engine bay of the Ferrari is finally sandblasted. Mike O'Neill from Wrench came over, he did an awesome job on this thing. I wasn't planning on having an episode out quite yet, but I've made some decent progress over the last week despite being out of town for about half of it, including I made some big decisions and cut a bunch of stuff out of the back of the car. I'm pretty excited to show you guys. This should be a fun episode. Let's dive in and get this thing one step closer to being done. Last week, we pulled the engine out of the Ferrari with the intention of preparing the engine bay for paint. It's the biggest, worst job left on the list, but the problem is there's a lot of rust between us and a finished paint job. There's also a lot of undercoating, as well as just old oil and grease that we need to get out of the way so we can finish a lot of important welding jobs too. So, back to where we left off. The first job on the list is to remove the filler neck for the intercooler system. It's riveted to the body, but the problem is the rivets I used were too long at the time, so they want to spin in place instead of simply drilling out. That's nothing a screwdriver can't fix, but we'll need to revise this mount when we go back for reassembly. Up next, we've got the isolator mounts for the exhaust, which are bolted to the rear crossmember. Following those, we'll turn our attention to the strut mounts for the engine cover. Painted hardware and tight clearances made removal of these mounts way more annoying than it should have been. And I still haven't decided if we're going to reinstall them later down the line. I've yet to flesh out exactly how I'm going to support and hinge the engine cover. But either way, these are coming off so we can get a nice clean layer of paint down. Because the coolant lines were assembled on the car, I'm going to leave them in place. But the brake lines are going to come off because I don't want to risk getting any sand in them during the blasting process. Up next is the removal of the battery and the battery box, the last of the large accessories. All that's left are all of the small brackets and knickknacks that are bolted to the rear bulkhead, such as the ECU and the PDM. There are a lot of holes here to tape up for sandblasting, so hopefully I managed to get them all. Now let's talk about these awful, disgusting fiberglass panels at the back of the car. In a normal 308, you'd never see these, but in this case, I just can't stand the sight of them. Frankly, the fiberglass looks awful. There's seam sealer everywhere, there's stuff bolted to these things. They are just as unsightly as it gets, and I tried to convince myself many moons ago that I could come to terms with them, that maybe I could clean them up a bit and make them look good, but honestly, I just don't think there's any way I'll ever be happy with them, so we're going to remove them and worry about an alternative later down the line. Admittedly though, this is really late in the game to be changing plans this drastically. I have no idea what I'm getting into, this could be a can of worms, and I could really regret this decision, because it could be a ton of work to solve, but honestly, I'd rather live with the pain of the discipline it takes to solve the problem than to live with the pain of regret in leaving these ugly panels in place and finishing the rest of the car. After drilling out the rivets and dealing with an insane amount of seam sealer, I did have to cut the fiberglass panel, as we'll be leaving a little bit of it in place. The bottom flange will give us something to attach to should we decide to build some sort of aluminum panel to replace this thing. I've got to say, I'm really happy with the result. Yeah, it's a gaping hole, but we'd find that in more or less any tube chassis car, and I'm totally fine with that over the fiberglass panels that were there before. We've got a lot of seam sealer to deal with, but hopefully the sandblasting will take care of it, and in the long run, we'll build some panels to close this stuff back in, but even in the short term, I think it'll look pretty good as is, and I'm not really worried about the aero implications, because we've got a lot of other stuff to work out first. We've still got more work to do on this part of the project, but I'm happy with where it stands. Now there is one last part that we need to remove from the Ferrari, and it's this lubricants plate that's riveted to the chassis. Small details like this are part of what makes the 308 so cool, but instead of just bolting it back into place when we're done, I've got a little bit of an idea on how we can revamp it and add a special touch. The first step was to remove the tag, and then I measured it very carefully so that I could recreate it on the computer. I opened up Photoshop, redrew the tag, and instead of the old information, I replaced everything with accurate Pennzoil lubricants that are actually in the car. I did my best to recreate all of the original fonts and to use period-correct Pennzoil logos so that anybody that didn't know better would never know this wasn't original. So now it accurately reflects the Pennzoil lubricants we're using, and it should be a really cool touch. Now it's going to take a few weeks to get this badge, but I've got an example of what we're going to be doing on the workbench. I made this stainless etch badge a few years ago for some roll bars, and I think the look is going to be perfect. This one features black lettering on a stainless background, so all we need to do this time around is to invert it, so we have a black background with stainless lettering to accurately mimic the original tag. With how synonymous Ferrari and Pennzoil are, I think this is going to be a really cool touch that'll go unnoticed by everyone but you guys. With the engine bay totally cleared out, now we need to start protecting things from the sandblasting process. The most important things to protect are the glass and any rubber seals. Obviously, we don't want to hit the paint if we can avoid it, but because we're going to be painting the car later down the line, I'm not really worried if we happen to nick it. Now, some of you guys are definitely thinking, Mike, painter's tape is not going to stop sandblasting, and you are correct. The painter's tape is just a base layer, and over the top of it, we're going to apply a complete layer of Gorilla Tape for actual protection. The double layer is just so that we can get the Gorilla Tape off of the car. To be clear, the Gorilla Tape isn't going to survive a direct hit from the sandblaster, but it'll keep us from any incidental damage if we get a little bit crazy with things. After all, it's not really standard practice to sandblast half of a car. Last but not least, it felt critical to remove the rear fender flares because just like the painter's tape, they would not hold up to a direct hit from bead blasting, and due to the cost of these things, it felt not worth the risk whatsoever. Off camera, I wrapped the rest of the car in cheap yoga mats and then set Mike off to do his thing. He donned his gear, grabbed his tools, and then got to work. Now, if you aren't familiar with Mike or his channel, Wrench, you need to check it out. I've got a link in the description to his latest build, a gorgeous 911 that features a 3-liter twin-turbo Subaru engine. He just got the car back from paint, and he's on the final stretch to get his car ready for SEMA. His channel documents the entire build process from start to its current state. If you like what's going on my channel, you're sure to love his content too, so go check it out and support a fellow creator. And of course, if you need some sandblasting done, he's your guy too. Now before we can see the results of Mike's labor, we've got to get all of the tape pulled off of the car. It's kind of like unwrapping a present if that present was a gift bag full of sand. Okay, so maybe not the best example, but I'm excited to unwrap this one. With everything unwrapped and blasted with shop air, we can finally get a good look at the work Mike performed. Mike and his business, Fresh Steel, did an amazing job on this thing. It was a lot of work to get to this point, but I'm really happy with the outcome. This thing looks way better than it ever did with all that factory Ferrari coating. We've now got fresh steel to weld to, and this thing will look way better than it ever did from the factory with some fresh paint on it. So it is bright and early the next morning, really not even bright yet. Before I left last night, I draped the back of the car in plastic with the goal of trying to prevent some surface flash rusting, because this is sandblasted, it's going to flash rust really quickly. We want to prevent that. Now, how much will plastic over the back of the car do? I don't really know. We are near the ocean. There's a lot of salty moisture in the air no matter what I'm going to do about it. But I do have one piece to kind of showcase my thought process here. This is a decorative plate we made a long time ago for the chassis. I showed them in the last episode. They're oriented in the car kind of like this surface facing upwards. And I mentioned that most of the rust I see here in the shop is on horizontal surfaces. It's like it's fallout landing on surfaces, water vapor landing on horizontal planes. versus just exposure to moisture in the air, because the side plane of this thing isn't rusty at all, and they are both exposed to the same thing. So I'm hopeful if I just keep water vapor from kind of landing on the car, it won't rust. So let's pull the plastic back, let's see what we're working with, and let's get started on a long, hot day of TIG welding. Surprisingly, the plastic does seem to work, at least for the first night. The metal is still as good as the moment Mike blasted it. But there is one issue to contend with. There is sand absolutely everywhere. A lot of you guys expressed concerns about this, instead suggesting that I go with dry ice blasting, but dry ice blasting wouldn't actually remove the finish from the chassis, it would just clean it up. So the unfortunate reality is, now we've got to deal with sand everywhere, including inside of the car. Anywhere this sand could find a hole or a crevice, it went. But the way I'm coming to terms with this is by telling myself this was an inevitability. The first time I send this car off the track at a course like Button Willow, I'm gonna fill the inside of it with sand and dirt anyway. Eventually, every nook and cranny and every crevice possible will be filled with muck from racing, so in a sense I've just gotten it out of the way nice and early. At least that's what I'm telling myself. However, we've got a lot of welding to do, so let's do a basic cleanup of the sand and then get to work. If you're new to this series, this build represents my journey of learning to TIG weld, and it's important to me to TIG weld absolutely everything possible. I won't say that my welds will be Instagram worthy, but they'll definitely look a lot better than the factory Ferrari welds on this chassis. It's going to take me a full day, if not two, to finish weld everything in the back of the car. A lot of stuff is only tack welded into place or only half finished. And most of what's left to weld is somewhat difficult to get to. That's why I haven't welded it so far. But even once the welding's out of the way, there's still some other stuff we've got to get done. For example, a lot of it's detail work. I need to make some caps that go on the end of these square tubes so that we're not collecting debris in them and it finishes out the look. There are some gussets that I need to put into corners, some tough-to-reach welds that I'll have to save till the end, and lots of little tabs and mounts still attached to the chassis from Ferrari that I need to cut off and smooth out. For example, the original brake line mounts have got to go. There's also still a little bit of seam sealer still attached to the chassis because it tends to deflect bead blasting media, making it difficult to remove. There's also those rusty plates that I showcased earlier in the episode, the decorative ones that cover up an ugly part of the chassis. I'm going to redo these because they're currently notched for fiberglass that's no longer there, and while I could weld them into place, this would look pretty poor, and it's definitely not up to my standards. This is one of those unfortunate byproducts of removing that fiberglass. And then there's the lower control arm mounts for the back of the car. In the last episode, I showcased why I want to redesign these, primarily because they are attached to the chassis with a through bolt instead of actually welded into place. I booted up Fusion 360 and designed a new mount that we can actually weld to the chassis, and as a result, the suspension as a whole should be a lot more robust. This mount can't pivot, and it should be a lot more difficult to rip off the chassis should the worst happen. You'll notice though that this time around there are 3 holes. The middle one is accurate to the original mount, but I've decided to take the opportunity and add one above and one below in case I want to make some adjustments or changes in the future. So if we come back to the car, reinsert the suspension arm in the downward position, that's how I had them, versus that, which I think was factory. We can test our part, and line it up. Looks really nice, lines up exactly as it should for the middle hole, and we have some extra adjustment if we ever want to make some changes. So let's send these out. So we've got a plan laid out in front of us, and I'm feeling pretty good about how this should turn out. I'll still say I'm not in love with the way that this chassis looks, but Mike's sandblasting has made it look at least a lot better than it did. Seeing the raw steel has me wondering if it would look a little bit better painted something like a dark silver, but I think I'm still going to stick with black. I'd like to hide most of this stuff and make the engine the centerpiece of this build, instead of focusing on the ugly chassis Ferrari built, and I'm doing my best to improve. It's been a lot of work to get to this point, but with paint out of the way, it really feels like it's mostly just final assembly left. So as we approach one of the biggest milestones of this build so far, the inevitable first drive, I want to give one more thanks to everyone that's been here since day one and for everybody that has just subscribed. I wouldn't be able to complete this build, nor would I put the effort in on these episodes if it weren't for you guys. So clearly I've got a lot of work cut out for me. I'm going to go hammer down over the weekend. I have my schedule cleared. I'm going to dedicate it to this thing because obviously it ain't gonna get done otherwise, and we gotta get paint on this thing ASAP. It's gonna rust if we don't. It's gonna look like those plates that we gotta rebuild. Got a lot of welding, fabrication to do, and that paint is not gonna be easy, especially cleaning all of the sand out of this thing as best I can, at least. I'm nervous about it. I also gotta mask the whole car off. This is gonna be a bunch of work, but fingers crossed, if everything goes according to plan, next episode will be everything finished and maybe paint as well. I'm gonna try to make that happen for you. We'll see. I think it should look pretty good. Let me know what you guys think. I appreciate the support as always. I'll catch you in the next one.